The lobby of the corporation gleamed under 1,000 recessed lights, marble floors polished so bright they mirrored the ceiling. And just past 9 in the morning, a woman named Karen Whitmore stepped through the revolving doors as though she owned the building itself. She wore sunglasses despite being indoors, a coat draped loosely over her shoulders like a cape, and behind her an assistant pushed a cart piled high with more than a dozen shopping bags bearing the names of designers most people would only ever see in magazines. Karen was the wife of a major shareholder, a woman who had spent the better part of 2 decades believing that her husband's money had somehow become her own personal currency of authority. She walked as if every door should open for her, every chair should be pulled out for her, and every person she encountered existed solely to make her morning easier. Near the entrance, standing quietly with his hands in the pockets of a plain button-down shirt, was a man named Marcus Johnson, 42 years old, calm in a way that made the chaos around him seem distant and unimportant. He had arrived early, as he often did, simply to watch the ordinary rhythms of the company breathe before the formal business of the day began. Marcus never announced himself when he entered a room. He preferred plain clothes, quiet corners, and the kind of observation that most people mistook for idleness. He liked to watch how people behaved when they assumed no one of consequence was looking, because that, he had learned long ago, was where the truth of a person's character lived. That particular morning was no ordinary morning inside the tower. A merger worth billions of dollars was set to be finalized within the hour, and shareholders from across the country had flown in for the occasion. Executives moved briskly through the halls with tablets and folders. Security guards stood a little straighter than usual, and the air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Karen, however, was not thinking about mergers or shareholders or billions of dollars. She was thinking about her bags, her schedule, and the inconvenience of her assistant suddenly receiving an urgent phone call that pulled him away toward the parking garage. Left alone with her cart of belongings, she scanned the lobby the way a queen might scan a servants' hall, searching for the nearest person she could command into service. Her eyes landed on Marcus. He was standing near the doors, unremarkable in appearance by her estimation, wearing nothing that signaled wealth or status the way she measured such things. To Karen, a man dressed simply, with skin the color of warm mahogany, standing near an entrance at 9 in the morning could only be one thing, and in her mind, that thing was beneath her. She did not consider, even for a moment, that appearances might deceive her. She did not pause to wonder who he might be waiting for, or why he carried himself with such unhurried confidence. She saw a category, not a person, and categories, in her experience, existed to serve people like her. She adjusted her sunglasses, tightened her grip on her handbag, and began walking toward him with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had already decided how the next few minutes would unfold. The lobby around them continued its ordinary business, oblivious to the small storm quietly gathering near the revolving doors. A pair of junior employees hurried past with coffee cups in hand. A receptionist answered a ringing phone, and somewhere above them an elevator chimed as it reached another floor. None of it mattered to Karen. Her focus had narrowed entirely onto Marcus, onto the cart of bags behind her, and onto the tower of floors above where the boardroom waited, gleaming and important, for a meeting she assumed she had every right to attend. She did not know his name. She did not care to ask it. In her mind, names were unnecessary details reserved for people worth remembering. Karen stopped a few feet from Marcus, tilted her chin upward, and without any greeting at all, tossed her car keys onto the cart beside her bags. The sound of metal against fabric rang out sharper than she intended, drawing a few curious glances from nearby employees. She pointed toward the elevators, her voice carrying easily across the marble floor. "You there?" she said, her tone flat and commanding. "Take all of this up to the 38th floor, the executive boardroom, and do try not to scratch anything." Marcus looked at her for a moment, unhurried, before responding with the same calm politeness he offered everyone regardless of how they treated him. "I am sorry," he said, "but I do not work in this building service department." His voice held no anger, no defensiveness, only a simple statement of fact, delivered the way one might correct a small misunderstanding about directions. Karen laughed, a short, sharp sound that seemed to enjoy its own cruelty. "I know your type," she said, looking him up and down as though inspecting a piece of furniture she had already decided not to purchase. She had built an entire worldview on such assumptions, one where a man's clothing, the tone of his skin, and his choice to stand quietly near a doorway told her everything she believed she needed to know. In Hemint, there was no possible version of reality in which a man who looked like Marcus, dressed the way Marcus was dressed, could belong anywhere near the executive floors of a Fortune 500 company. Surely, she reasoned, he was custodial staff, or perhaps a security guard on a break, someone whose presence in the lobby existed only to keep the building running smoothly for people who actually mattered. She had no interest in revising that assumption, and even less interest in the man's actual answer. A few passers-by slowed their steps, drawn by the rising volume of Karen's voice, though none of them yet understood the shape of what was unfolding. An older woman near the reception desk glanced up from her monitor, frowning slightly at the tone she overheard. A young man in a pressed suit paused near the elevator bank, phone still in hand, watching with the particular curiosity people reserve for conflicts they suspect will only get worse. Marcus remained precisely as he had been before Karen arrived, steady, unbothered, his expression revealing nothing beyond mild patience. He had encountered people like Karen before, more times than he could count across the decades of his life, and he had long ago decided that reacting to cruelty with more cruelty accomplished nothing worth accomplishing. Instead, he simply repeated himself, gently, as though speaking to someone who genuinely needed the clarification. "I think there has been some confusion," he said. "I am not employed here in the way you are assuming." Karen's patience, thin to begin with, evaporated entirely at what she perceived as insolence. She straightened her shoulders, raised her voice another notch, and declared that she had never in her life been spoken to with such disrespect by someone in his position. The word position hung in the air with all the weight she intended it to carry, a reminder, in her mind, of exactly where each of them stood in the world's order of importance. She informed him, loudly enough for half the lobby to hear, that people like him existed to serve people like her, and that his refusal to simply do as told was proof of exactly the kind of attitude problem she had come to expect from certain kinds of people. She did not use gentler words. She did not soften her meaning. She said precisely what she believed, confident that her husband's shares in the company gave her the standing to say it without consequence. The lobby grew quieter around them, not because anyone intervened, but because the small crowd gathering near the entrance had begun to sense that something significant was happening, even if they could not yet name what it was. A security guard near the front desk shifted his weight, clearly recognizing Marcus but saying nothing, caught between the instinct to protect a man he respected and the fear of overstepping his role. Marcus caught the guard's eye briefly and gave the faintest shake of his head, a silent instruction to let the moment play out rather than intervene. He was curious, in a quiet and almost clinical way, to see how far Karen's certainty would carry her before reality caught up with her assumptions. He folded his hands behind his back and waited, patient as stone, while Karen continued building the very foundation that would soon collapse beneath her. Karen, mistaking his silence for submission, pressed further into her tirade. She began questioning his education, wondering aloud whether people like him even finished school before entering what she assumed was a lifetime of manual labor. She speculated about his background, his neighborhood, his upbringing, weaving together a narrative entirely from her own prejudice rather than a single fact she actually knew. Each sentence she spoke revealed more about her own character than it did about Marcus, though she seemed entirely unaware of the mirror she had accidentally turned toward herself. Several employees nearby exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort growing visible even as none of them yet dared to speak up. A young intern near the coffee station whispered to a colleague that the woman clearly had no idea who she was talking to, though neither of them said it loud enough for Karen to hear. Marcus, for his part, remained a study in restraint. He absorbed each insult without flinching, without raising his voice, without offering the satisfaction of a reaction Karen seemed to be hunting for. There was something almost peaceful in his stillness, a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to the storm of contempt Karen continued to pour into the space between them. He had learned long ago that dignity was not something other people could take from him, no matter how loudly they shouted or how viciously they judged him on sight. He thought, briefly, of the years long before this particular morning, years spent sweeping floors and loading trucks and driving delivery routes before anyone in a boardroom ever knew his name, and the memory steadied him rather than stung him. Karen, unaware of any of this, mistook his composure for weakness, and weakness, in her worldview, was something to be exploited rather than respected. Frustrated that Marcus refused to break, Karen decided to escalate the confrontation toward its next inevitable stage. She scanned the lobby until she located a security guard standing near the reception desk and gestured sharply for him to approach. When he arrived, visibly uncertain, She demanded that he remove Marcus from the premises immediately, insisting that his continued presence near the elevators constituted a disturbance to the building's operations. The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly toward Marcus before returning to Karen, caught in a position no one envies, torn between a demanding shareholder's wife and a man he recognized but could not openly identify without disrupting whatever quiet test seemed to be unfolding. Marcus offered the guard a small, reassuring nod, as if to say that no intervention was necessary, that the moment would resolve itself soon enough without anyone needing to make a scene. "There is no need to make this larger than it already is," Marcus said calmly, addressing both Karen and the visibly uncomfortable guard. His voice carried no anger, only the steady patience of a man who had weathered far worse storms than this one. Karen, however, interpreted his composure as further evidence of her own victory, convinced that her aggressive tone had successfully cowed him into silence. She turned back to the small crowd that had gathered, raising her voice once more to declare that this was precisely the kind of behavior that gave certain people a bad name, that if he had simply done his job without arguing, none of this unpleasantness would have been necessary. She smoothed her coat with a satisfied flourish, believing the confrontation to be effectively over, believing herself to have won something meaningful. Around them, the mood among the gathered employees had shifted decisively. What had begun as passive curiosity had hardened into quiet disapproval, though no one yet felt emboldened enough to challenge Karen directly. A secretary near the front desk leaned toward a coworker and murmured that the woman clearly had no idea whose presence she was dismissing so carelessly, her voice pitched low enough to avoid drawing attention. Another employee, a young analyst still holding his morning coffee, shook his head slowly, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and second-hand embarrassment. None of them intervened, not out of indifference, but because something in Marcus's calm demeanor suggested he needed no rescuing, that whatever was coming would arrive precisely when it needed to arrive. Near the reception desk, a woman named Priscilla Adams, who had worked as an executive secretary for nearly 15 years, watched the entire scene unfold with a growing sense of disbelief. She had seen entitled visitors before, shareholders' relatives who treated the building as though it existed purely for their convenience, but something about Karen's particular cruelty struck her as unusually cold, unusually confident in its own cruelty. She considered stepping forward to intervene, perhaps offering some polite excuse to separate the two of them, but she hesitated, uncertain whether her interference would help the situation or simply give Karen a new target to redirect her anger toward. She glanced instead toward Marcus, noting the calm set of his shoulders, and decided, as the security guard had decided moments earlier, that whatever was happening did not require rescuing from anyone in the lobby that morning. A pair of interns near the elevator bank exchanged whispered commentary, one of them recording nothing on his phone but watching intently nonetheless, already composing in his mind the story he would tell his roommates that evening. Neither of them recognized Marcus by sight, since he rarely appeared in photographs distributed internally and preferred, whenever possible, to walk the building's public spaces without any entourage announcing his arrival. They assumed, much as Karen had assumed, that the calm man in the plain shirt was simply an employee absorbing an unfair tongue lashing from an entitled visitor, and their sympathy, without any deeper knowledge of who he actually was, rested entirely with him regardless. Marcus, watching Karen bask in her presumed triumph, felt no urge to correct her prematurely. He had spent enough years observing human behavior to understand that people like Karen rarely learned from gentle correction. They required the full weight of consequence to shake loose even a fraction of self-awareness. He preferred, in this instance, to let the moment continue unfolding naturally, trusting that the truth had its own timing and its own way of arriving exactly when it was most instructive. He glanced briefly toward the elevator banks at the far end of the lobby, aware of the minutes ticking steadily toward the meeting that awaited him upstairs, and decided that patience remained the wiser course for just a little while longer. The tension in the lobby thickened as an announcement crackled softly over the building's intercom system, a polite voice informing all attendees that the board of directors would convene in 5 minutes in the executive conference room on the 38th floor. Karen's expression brightened instantly at the announcement, her earlier irritation melting into anticipation as she remembered her own reason for being in the building that morning. She had come, in part, to accompany her husband to a reception planned for major shareholders following the meeting, and she fully intended to occupy a seat of honor among the observers permitted near the boardroom. She smoothed her hair, adjusted her sunglasses atop her head, and began walking briskly toward the private elevator reserved for board members and senior executives, the one situated just beyond the main bank of public elevators. Marcus, having concluded his silent observation, began walking in the same direction, his pace unhurried but purposeful. Karen noticed him moving toward the same restricted elevator and immediately stepped into his path, blocking his way with the kind of proprietary confidence she had displayed all morning. "People like you do not use this elevator," she informed him, gesturing toward the private doors as though guarding a treasure vault from an intruder. "This one is reserved for executives and board members," she added, her tone dripping with the satisfaction of someone delivering a final, humiliating blow. Marcus said nothing in response, offering only the faintest, knowing smile, the kind of expression that might have given Karen pause had she been paying closer attention to anything beyond her own certainty. At that precise moment, the private elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and a sharply dressed executive assistant stepped out, her eyes immediately finding Marcus among the small crowd gathered near the doors. She inclined her head respectfully, addressing him with unmistakable deference. "Sir," she said, "everyone upstairs is waiting for you." The words landed in the lobby like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation unfold. Karen's expression froze, her earlier certainty faltering for the first time that morning as she processed the assistant's words and the reverent tone in which they had been delivered. She turned slowly toward Marcus, searching his face for some explanation, some reassurance that she had not just made a catastrophic misjudgment in front of dozens of witnesses. Marcus stepped past her without hurry, following the assistant into the private elevator as the doors began to close behind him. Karen remained rooted in place, her mind racing to reconcile the scene she had just witnessed with the assumptions she had built her entire morning around. The small crowd that had gathered near the entrance exchanged glances heavy with unspoken meaning, several of them already suspecting the shape of what was about to unfold upstairs. A young receptionist covered her mouth briefly, stifling a gasp she could not quite suppress. Karen, still processing, took a hesitant step toward the closing doors, though she knew, somewhere beneath her rapidly crumbling confidence, that whatever waited for her upstairs would not be the vindication she had spent the last 20 minutes constructing for herself. When the elevator doors opened on the 38th floor, Marcus stepped into a room filled with quiet, expectant energy. Executives and board members rose from their seats in near-perfect unison, a wave of respect moving through the room like a current. The chief executive officer crossed the space first, extending his hand warmly and greeting him not by a title reserved for staff, but by the title reserved for the man who had founded the very company gathered in that room. Several board members echoed the greeting, addressing him as chairman, their voices carrying the unmistakable warmth reserved for someone whose vision had built the foundation beneath all of their careers. Marcus shook each hand in turn, his calm demeanor unchanged from the one he had worn in the lobby only moments before, as though nothing about the transition from stranger to founder required any adjustment on his part at all. Karen, having followed at a cautious distance after gathering what courage she could, arrived at the boardroom entrance just in time to witness the scene in its entirety. She stood frozen in the doorway, her earlier confidence utterly extinguished, replaced by a creeping horror as the pieces of the morning rearranged themselves into a shape she had not anticipated. The man she had ordered to carry her bags, the man she had mocked in front of dozens of witnesses, the man she had forbidden from using an elevator meant for executives, was in fact the chairman of the board, the founder of the corporation, and by a significant margin the largest individual shareholder in the entire company. The room fell into a heavy silence as several board members turned toward the doorway, their expressions shifting from warmth to something considerably cooler as they recognized the woman standing there. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before any words emerged, her composure crumbling in real time before an audience she had never intended to perform for. She stammered an apology, insisting that there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that she had simply mistaken him for someone else, that she never would have spoken to him that way had she known who he truly was. She claimed the entire exchange had been a joke gone wrong, an attempt at humor that had simply landed badly in the moment. Marcus listened to her explanation without interruption, his expression neither angry nor triumphant, only thoughtful, as though weighing her words against everything he had witnessed only minutes earlier in the lobby below. When she finally finished, Marcus asked a single question, delivered quietly but with unmistakable weight. "If I had truly been a member of the service staff today," he asked, "would you have treated me any differently?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable in any way that would not further condemn her, and Karen found herself utterly unable to respond. The silence that followed said more than any words could have, confirming for everyone present exactly what kind of person had been standing in their lobby only minutes before. Several board members exchanged glances, their expressions making clear that they understood precisely what had transpired, and precisely what it revealed about the woman now standing in their doorway. Marcus turned to address the room, his voice steady and unhurried as he began to speak, not with anger, but with the quiet authority of a man who had earned every ounce of respect currently filling the space around him. He reminded them, as he often did during moments that called for perspective, that his own story had not begun in boardrooms or executive suites. He had once mopped floors in buildings far smaller than this one, loaded trucks before dawn, and driven delivery routes through neighborhoods that never once imagined the driver behind the wheel might someday found a corporation worth billions of dollars. He told them he had never forgotten what it felt like to be looked through rather than looked at, to be judged by a uniform or a task rather than by the substance of his character. That memory, he explained, had shaped every decision he had made since, from how he treated employees to how he evaluated potential partners in business. He spoke, too, of a specific afternoon many years earlier, when he had been turned away from a job interview simply because the receptionist assumed, upon seeing him walk through the door in worn shoes, that he must have wandered in by mistake, looking for a different department entirely. He had not argued that day, had simply thanked her politely and walked back out into the cold, though the memory of that dismissal had stayed lodged in him for years afterward, sharpening rather than dulling with time. He mentioned as well the countless small kindnesses that had carried him through those difficult years, a stranger who once shared half a sandwich with him outside a train station, a teacher who had stayed late without pay to help him understand mathematics he had missed while working double shifts, a mentor who had seen potential in him long before any resume or credential could have suggested it existed. Each of those moments, he explained, had taught him that judgment offered freely and without evidence said more about the person judging than the person being judged, a lesson he had carried into every boardroom he had ever entered since. He continued, his voice carrying easily across the hushed room, explaining that he had always measured people not by their clothing, their complexion, or their apparent status, but by their character, their integrity, and the way they treated those who could offer them nothing in return. That principle, he said, had guided the company from its earliest days as a small operation running out of a modest office through every merger and expansion that had brought them to this room today. Several board members nodded slowly, their expressions reflecting a mixture of respect and quiet reflection, as though the reminder had landed exactly where it needed to. Karen remained silent throughout, her earlier bravado entirely gone, replaced by the sinking realization that everyone in the room now understood precisely who she was. After a long pause, Marcus turned the conversation toward the matter of consequence, addressing the company's ethics committee directly, rather than allowing the incident to pass without acknowledgement. He noted that while Karen herself held no formal position within the corporation, her husband did, and the influence she had clearly assumed came directly from that connection. The board discussed the matter briefly, weighing the implications of allowing such behavior to go unaddressed simply because it had occurred outside the boundaries of formal employment. Ultimately, they reached a unified decision, one that stripped Karen of every informal privilege she had enjoyed within company circles, revoking her access to internal gatherings and shareholder events she had previously attended as a matter of course. They further required her husband to appear before the committee and account for the manner in which his position had apparently been leveraged to grant his wife a sense of unearned authority throughout the building. The chief executive officer rose to address the room once the decision had been finalized, his voice firm and unwavering as he delivered the company's official position. This corporation, he said, will not tolerate discrimination in any form, regardless of who commits it or under what circumstances it occurs. The statement drew immediate and unanimous agreement from everyone present, as a wave of nodding heads and quiet murmurs of approval moving through the room like a current finally released from tension. Karen, standing alone near the doorway, absorbed the weight of the room's collective judgment, understanding at last that no apology she could offer would undo the spectacle she had created for herself. She turned and left the boardroom in silence, her earlier confidence replaced entirely by the quiet shame of a woman who had built her identity on assumptions the world had just publicly dismantled. The meeting continued for another hour, the merger discussed and finalized with the same careful precision that had brought the company to its current position of strength. But something had shifted in the room beyond the numbers on the agenda, a a renewed sense among the board members of the values Marcus had built the company upon, values that extended far beyond quarterly earnings and shareholder returns. Several executives later admitted privately that the morning's events had reminded them why they respected their chairman as deeply as they did, not merely for his business acumen, but for the consistency between his stated principles and his actual conduct when no one expected him to be tested. The merger itself, once the board returned its attention to the matter that had originally brought them together, proceeded with the same careful precision the company had always been known for under Marcus's leadership. Representatives from the acquiring firm, a mid-sized technology company specializing in data infrastructure, presented their final terms with visible relief once the earlier commotion in the lobby had settled into resolved silence. The chief financial officer walked the room through projected synergies, cost savings, and revenue growth expected over the following 3 years, numbers that would eventually be celebrated in press releases and investor calls scheduled for later that week. Marcus listened attentively throughout, asking pointed questions about employee retention plans for the acquired company, insisting, as he always did during such negotiations, that no merger would proceed under his chairmanship without clear protections for the workers whose jobs depended on the outcome. Several board members exchanged small, knowing smiles at the familiar insistence, having grown accustomed over the years to their chairman's unwavering focus on the human cost behind every financial transaction. By the time the merger papers were finally signed, shortly after noon, a quiet mood of accomplishment had settled over the room, tempered only slightly by the memory of what had transpired before the meeting began. One of the newer board members, a woman named Patricia Ellison, who had joined only 8 months earlier, leaned toward a colleague during a brief recess and admitted that she had never before witnessed a chairman handle such a personal insult with the composure Marcus had displayed. Her colleague nodded, explaining that this was simply how Marcus operated, that his reputation for steady, unshakable calm under provocation had become something of a legend among longtime employees, many of whom had their own stories of watching him diffuse tension that would have unraveled lesser leaders entirely. Patricia found herself studying him with renewed curiosity for the remainder of the meeting, recognizing in his quiet authority something she suspected she would spend years trying to fully understand. News of the morning's events eventually reached even the acquiring company's representatives, who had arrived too late to witness the confrontation firsthand but heard fragments of it during the lunch break that followed the signing. One of their senior negotiators remarked privately to a colleague that the story, whatever its exact details, seemed to confirm everything he had heard about the culture Marcus had built within his organization, a culture that apparently extended its principles even to moments of public embarrassment, rather than abandoning them the instant real money and reputation were at stake. It was, he suggested, exactly the kind of company he felt reassured to be merging with, one whose stated values appeared to survive contact with actual pressure rather than dissolving the moment convenience demanded otherwise. His colleague agreed, noting that such alignment of stated principle and lived practice had become rare enough in the corporate world that its mere existence felt almost remarkable. Later that afternoon, as the meeting concluded and attendees began filtering out toward the elevators, Marcus walked back through the same lobby where the morning's confrontation had unfolded. Near the entrance, a member of the cleaning staff had accidentally tipped over a cart of supplies, spilling bottles and cloths across the polished floor in a small, embarrassing clatter. Without hesitation, Marcus knelt down and began helping to gather the scattered items, working alongside the visibly flustered custodian as though the task required nothing more than an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. No one had asked him to help. No board member stood nearby to witness the gesture and record it for posterity. He simply did it, quietly and without ceremony, because that was who he had always been long before anyone in that building knew his name. "No work makes a person lesser," he said gently to the custodian, helping to steady the cart once the last bottle had been returned to its place. "It is only the way we treat others that reveals our true worth." Several employees who happened to be passing through the lobby paused to watch the small exchange, visibly moved by the quiet sincerity of the gesture. One member of the board, lingering nearby after the meeting, remarked to a colleague that today they had learned something far more valuable than any lesson about corporate governance. They had witnessed a living demonstration of what respect actually looked like when practiced consistently, even in moments no one was watching closely enough to reward it. As the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of the lobby, Marcus stepped out through the same revolving doors he had entered that morning, walking into the warmth of the New York sunshine without fanfare or announcement. Somewhere near the edge of the plaza, Karen stood watching from a distance, her earlier arrogance replaced entirely by a quiet, uncomfortable clarity. She understood now, in a way she had never allowed herself to understand before, that money could purchase influence, property, and even temporary deference from strangers, but it could never purchase genuine respect or true dignity. Those things, she realized too late, were earned only through the accumulated weight of a person's character, revealed most clearly in the moments when they believed no one of consequence was watching. Karen's husband, a heavy-set man named Gerald Whitmore, who had built a modest fortune trading commodities before marrying into circles far wealthier than his own origins, arrived at the tower less than an hour after the board's decision had been finalized. He had been summoned rather than invited, of a distinction he understood the moment he saw the tightness in the executive assistant's expression as she led him toward a smaller conference room down the hall from the main boardroom. He found his wife already seated inside, her earlier bravado replaced by a brittle, wounded silence that made him uneasy before anyone had spoken a single word. When the committee explained what had transpired that morning, Gerald's face drained of color, the weight of the situation settling over him with the particular heaviness reserved for consequences he had never imagined his own household might invite upon itself. He apologized on his wife's behalf, though the apology felt hollow even as he offered it, colored more by fear of losing his standing among shareholders than by genuine remorse for what had actually occurred in the lobby that morning. The committee listened patiently, then explained, in measured and unemotional language, that his continued standing as a shareholder was not currently in question, but that the informal privileges his family had long enjoyed within company circles would be reconsidered going forward. Gerald nodded stiffly, understanding that no argument he could offer would soften the position the board had already reached. Karen sat beside him throughout the conversation, staring at a fixed point on the table, unable to meet the eyes of anyone in the room, least of all her own husband, whose disappointment radiated from him in waves she had never once anticipated having to face. Word of the confrontation spread through the building with the particular speed reserved for stories that confirm what people already suspected about certain kinds of arrogance. By midday, employees on nearly every floor had heard some version of the events, some accurate, some exaggerated, though the essential truth remained consistent, no matter how the details shifted in the retelling. A young woman working in the marketing department mentioned to her supervisor that she had once seen Karen behave similarly toward a delivery driver in the parking garage months earlier, an incident that had gone unreported at the time simply because no one believed complaining would change anything. Her supervisor nodded grimly, admitting that she too had witnessed smaller, quieter versions of the same entitlement over the years, 2 moments dismissed at the time as simply the unfortunate price of doing business with wealthy shareholders and their families. The stories, once shared, seemed to unlock something among the staff, a collective willingness to speak openly about behavior they had previously endured in silence. Several employees approached the Human Resources Department that same afternoon, describing patterns of disrespect they had experienced from various shareholders and their relatives over the years, encouraged by the knowledge that the chairman himself had just demonstrated, through his own conduct, that such behavior would no longer be quietly tolerated. The company's ethics committee, already occupied with Karen's case, found itself reviewing a small but meaningful stack of additional complaints by the end of the day, each one a reminder of how deeply entrenched certain assumptions about status and worth had become within the culture of the building. Marcus, informed of the growing list later that evening, expressed no surprise, only a quiet determination that the incident in the lobby should mark a beginning rather than an isolated correction. That evening, long after most of the building had emptied for the day, Marcus remained in his office, reviewing the accumulated reports with the same careful attention he gave every decision that shaped the company's culture. He remembered, as he often did during such moments, the years before any of this had existed, when he had worked 3 jobs simultaneously to support a mother recovering from illness, sleeping only a handful of hours each night and eating whatever remained cheapest at the end of a long week. He remembered the manager who once refused to let him use the customer restroom at a warehouse job, assuming, based on nothing more than appearance, that he intended to steal something rather than simply relieve himself during a break. He remembered, too, the quiet kindness of a woman named Dorothy Reyes, an elderly accountant who had once loaned him bus fare without hesitation when his own ran short, a small gesture that had stayed with him for decades precisely because it cost her nothing yet meant everything to him at the time. Those memories, scattered across decades of struggle long before wealth or recognition arrived, had shaped every principle he now insisted upon within the company bearing his name. He often told new employees during orientation that talent could be found anywhere, in any neighborhood, wearing any kind of clothing, and that a company blind to that truth would eventually blind itself to its own greatest resources. He believed, with a conviction that had only deepened over the years, that the measure of an organization's character lay not in how it treated its most powerful stakeholders, but in how it treated its least powerful ones, the custodians, the delivery drivers, the interns, the receptionists who greeted every visitor with the same patient courtesy regardless of how that courtesy was returned. It was this belief, more than any strategic advantage or financial acumen, that he considered the true foundation of everything the company had built. The following morning, as employees returned to their desks and the lobby resumed its ordinary rhythm, few outward signs remained of the confrontation that had unfolded there only a day earlier. Yet something subtle had shifted within the building's culture, a quiet recalibration that manifested itself in small, almost imperceptible ways. A security guard who had previously waved certain visitors through without question began greeting everyone with the same measured attentiveness regardless of their appearance. A receptionist who had once deferred automatically to anyone dressed expensively found herself extending the same warm greeting to a delivery driver in work boots that she offered to a shareholder in a tailored suit. These small adjustments, multiplied across hundreds of employees over the following weeks, gradually reshaped the atmosphere of the building into something closer to the values Marcus had always claimed to represent, even if it had taken a very public reckoning to make those values fully visible. The lesson of that morning rippled quietly through the company in the days that followed, discussed in hushed tones near coffee stations and repeated, with growing embellishment, among employees who had witnessed only fragments of the original confrontation. But the truth at its center remained simple and unchanged, no matter how many times it was retold. Do not measure a person by the color of their skin, the plainness of their clothing, or the humility of their bearing, for such measurements say far more about the one making the judgment than about the one being judged. Respect, freely given without condition, is the foundation upon which every meaningful relationship is built, and true character reveals itself most honestly in how a person treats those they mistakenly believe themselves entitled to look down upon. Years later, employees who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand still recounted the story to new hires during their first week, less as gossip than as a kind of unofficial orientation into the values the company expected everyone to uphold. The tale had softened at its edges over time, details shifting slightly with each retelling, yet its central truth remained untouched by the passage of years. A chairman who could have simply announced his identity the moment Karen approached him instead chose to observe, to wait, to let her reveal the full measure of her own character before the truth of his identity ever entered the conversation. It was a small choice, made in a matter of minutes on an otherwise ordinary morning, yet it carried consequences that rippled outward through the culture of an entire corporation for years afterward. Marcus himself rarely spoke of the incident directly, preferring instead to let his continued conduct, quiet and consistent, serve as whatever explanation anyone might need. He understood, perhaps better than most people ever would, that a single dramatic gesture meant little if it was not backed by 1,000 smaller, unremarked ones, the daily accumulation of decency that never demanded an audience to remain genuine. It was in those unwitnessed moments, far more than in the dramatic reversal witnessed by dozens in a boardroom, that the truest measure of the man was finally, quietly, and permanently revealed.